Welcome to the Velog, the latest edition of our intermittent series of ride staff videos about stuff to do with cycling. Not a lot going on in the bike race and sportive scene at the moment, as you can imagine. So thought we would try and spend a little bit of time putting together some stuff to keep you guys interested and tell some stories while we're restricted in our movements. So alongside the other stuff that I'm doing as ride staffs during this period, which is the main thing so far, is we've been doing some Zwift meetups for folk that have got the kit to keep training indoors, but appreciate that not all of you have that and might be needing something to amuse you during this time. So I phoned up an old friend, John Herety, who I've worked with over the course of the last few years. I worked for his cycling team for a couple of years and thought it'd be good to get John to tell some of the stories that chart the development of the team that lots of people watching this probably know as JLT Condor, but prior to that was Rafa Condor, and prior to that, even before that time, was recycling.co.uk. So this is going to be the first edition of what I think, if you enjoy them, will be a series of videos where I will sit on Zoom with John and just sort of nudge him along to like I say, just tell the stories that I think are quite interesting. They're a little bit illustrative of how cycling has changed in the UK over the last sort of decade and a half. But that story begins back in the early 2000s when John was the manager of the GB men's road cycling team. And the story begins with how John ceased to be manager of that team and how he became available to be manager of what at that time was recycling.co.uk. So we'll cut across to the story and I'll see you again at the other end. If you have got questions or comments that pop up out of this video when you see it first time, then stick them in the comments below and I can feed them into John next time and they'll kind of help the story move along. If there's something you want to know a little bit more about, yeah, just let us know and we'll see how this thing develops from here. So yeah, on to the story. Here we go. I think we were going to start the conversation by talking a little bit about you and how you first came to be available to be manager of this team, Rafa Condor Recycling at the time. So I was going to suggest that the story maybe starts in Madrid.
Oh, straight in with the controversy. I like it, Paul. Very good. That's right, yeah. So what would it have been? Probably 2000s, not probably, it was 2005. And I've got a little cheat note here for myself because I've been doing this that long. The seasons do tend to merge into one. But now at the time I was 2005 Madrid World Championships, I was working for British Cycling. I had been for about 9 years, and I'd looked after the team at all the World Championships from when the World Class Performance Program started. Then we got to Madrid, the World Championships, and this was an era when the professional side of the sport was still dominated by the European teams. Italy, Spain, Belgium in particular were very, very strong, especially at the World Championships, as to a certain extent they still are. But certainly Italy felt that they, owned the sport basically, and the World Championships was theirs. And we had a scenario in Madrid where two of the riders, I'll keep the story short so we can move on, but two of the riders from our team, Ciao Legalius and Tom Southern, were both riding for Italian teams at the time. And of course, when you go to World Championships, you're riding for your national team. This particular World Championships, this was before British Cycling with the strength that it was. It was still on the way up. Dave Brailsford was in charge. Peter Keane had left a year or so before that, but Dave was in charge, and we still didn't have a particularly good reputation in the professional road race championships. We weren't going there to actually win the race or anything like that. Obviously, we were trying to get as good a performance as possible. That was the remit from the government for the World Class Performance Programme. But it's still very much, we had limited numbers of riders.
I was just going to mention about that. So I think possibly some of the people that might be watching this might not be aware of how it works with the World Championships. It's not like the Football World Cup where everyone gets 11 players on the team.
No, size teams, depending on your position in the world rankings. And the rules have changed over the years, but in that era, we had quite a small team. I can't remember who the full team was, but there was Charlie, Bradley Wiggins, Tom Southern, Roger Hammond, and Roger was the rider that we're riding for, and that's what sort of caused and this is what caused my downfall or change of direction, should we say, as a result of what happened at that World Championships, basically. So I was the road manager. Dave Brailsford was the overall guy in charge of the whole team and the World Class Performance Programme. But ultimately, I was in charge of the day-to-day activities of the team. In that era, it was extremely difficult for British riders to get contracts. There was no Team Sky then, Team Ineos as it is now, but back then there was no Team Sky. British riders hadn't quite broken through at that point. They were coming, they hadn't quite broken through. And as a result of that, a British rider on a foreign team, basically you did as you were told. And to cut a long story short, if you like, Tom and Charlie Wegelius were told that if a certain situation arrived in that World Championships and the Italian national team needed their assistance, they would be asked to ride for the Italian national team in such a way that it wasn't, how can I say, it wasn't like, it was obvious because they were obviously on the front of the bunch riding, but not everyone, there was no reason for everyone to think naturally that they were riding for the Italian team per se. There's a strong argument to say it's not their job to do it. And if I'd have been stood by the same side of the road, I'd have been saying exactly the same thing if I didn't know, obviously, the history behind it and so on. So I think I won't be going to, I don't think it's too, big a leap to say, it's like mafia time still in cycling. I'm not sure it's completely disappeared from the Italian scene. So those two riders were basically threatened that they wouldn't get contracts the following year for their teams if they didn't ride. Now, whether that was actually physically said, it was definitely implied, no question about it. So they basically, Charlie told me the night before that this was a possibility, and I chose to say, well, I'm not happy about it. I didn't choose to say I wasn't happy about it. I didn't agree with it at all. I didn't particularly like the way the Italians try to throw their weight around at any race that I went to be honest. They felt that they owned the sport, and whilst they've contributed a lot to it, for me, that rubbed me up the wrong way. However, I also realised that both Charlie and Tom had a living to earn. Basically, if they didn't have a contract the year after, then they were going to struggle basically. So. At the end of the day, our tactics for that race was to ride for Roger Hammond for a bunch sprint. It would end up, we were pretty sure it was going to end up as a bunch sprint. It would come down the line. That's what the Italians were after. That's what the Belgian teams were after. So there was two of the big host nations, and Spain as well. It also turned out they wanted to do it as well. Valverde was there. So we felt, I felt, should I say, that at the end of the day, if these two riders did ride for the Italian teams, it was still assisting in our overall tactic. Basically, we were still gonna, it was still going to come down to a bunch sprint. The only problem was, this was the era of where the internet just kicked in. So for years, British sport, or the British sport of cycling, never had any coverage of the early laps of the World Championships. This was the privilege of Belgium and Italy, and as a result of that, all of a sudden the British commentators had 7 hours to commentate on it, and basically had no experience of doing this in terms of what they should and shouldn't be saying, or so we had this situation where Sean Kelly was one of the commentators, and going back years ago, Sean had been assisted in a World Championships by the whole of the Belgium team, and he was having to sort of kind of make excuses when you saw these two riders riding in the front of the bunch, and so we were kind of a little bit of a victim of that, in terms of all of a sudden journalists were coming around to the pit area in the World Championships, because the team car follows the race as it does in all races of that level. But there's also 2 pit areas where Dave Brailsford was, and the journalists are allowed to mill around there. So there was a problem in so much that all of a sudden the commentators needed information, or they thought it was their job. That they suddenly were thrust into this sort of new era of like having to commentate and make content on the hoof. And whilst all those journalists knew the score, knew what happened at World Championships, and knew about these collusions, should we say, where teams either predetermined, do it beforehand, make an agreement beforehand, or usually they're made on the road, or they're sometimes not even spoken about. Everyone knows if you've got 2 teams that want a bunch sprint, then it's pretty obvious you're going to share the workload. 2 or 3 riders from each team are going to get on the front and bring back a break. So the scenario for the Italians was that they didn't want to use their whole team in the early part of the race, chasing down a pointless break that was allowed to get 10, 15 minutes because all the other teams basically went, well, down to the Belgians and the Italians, to bring it back. So this scenario, might not have happened. And so in my head, basically, I didn't say anything to Dave Brailsford. I just thought, this might not even happen. So, I'm not going to tell him anything. And that proved to be probably my downfall, to be honest. I probably should have told him. Whether or not that would have changed anything, who knows? We'll never know now. But and there was also a little caveat to this, is both Tom and Charlie didn't know for definite that they would be called upon. They hadn't been it had been muted to them. And then it turns out they only got told about 15, 20 minutes before the start of the race itself. So they came to me and told me. I told them it wasn't happening. And there was actually a journalist in the car with me as well, a very, very good journalist, actually. Alistair Fotheringham, William Fotheringham's brother. He won't like me saying it that way around. But Alistair in the car with me, and Alistair knows the score, but at the end of the day, I was like trying to have this cryptic conversation with Charlie to say, he's saying it's happening, and Alistair's going, well, what's happening? And I'm going, nothing's happening, sort of thing. Anyway, the race starts, and my worst nightmare ends up happening. A break goes up the road, gets 10, 12 minutes or something like that, and then all of a sudden, the nations that have only got 1 or 2 riders that ride for Italian teams suddenly started going to the front. So a Lithuanian, an Estonian, and 2 Brits end up being at the front of the bunch, towing the World Championship field round to cut down this time gap. The Italians didn't actually want it cutting down; they just want it to be held. To be honest, they didn't necessarily need those riders to work that hard to actually bring it completely back, but it was just so that they could keep it pegged at a safe. Within safe distance, so that when the hammer went down in the latter part of the race, their lead would just crumble, which is what happens, as you've seen many, many times on the Tour de France and many of these races where a break is allowed to establish itself, and it basically wears itself out. So that was the scenario. However, obviously, the problem with this was all the journalists were going, why are the Brits on the front? Why are you doing this? So then the Australian team came round to the who had a good team, the Australian team. So they were trying to get the Italians to do all the work. They didn't want any other teams to help them, sort of thing. So they were coming around to our tent, badgering Dave Brailsford, saying, you know, what the heck's going on. Max Schiandri was there, who was a Italian stroke Englishman. Looked after Max for many, many years, and he was making out to these journalists, I don't know what's going on. This wasn't part of the tactics. I don't know what's going on. I don't know why they're doing it. Of course he knew why they were doing it. You know, it was his flipping mates that had put these guys up to it, sort of thing. So that was a kind of looking back, it was a little bit annoying, but so that was it. Now, the irony of all this is that the British fans around the circuit were absolutely loving it, loving to see two Brits on the front trying to peg back this breakaway. They thought it was great. For years they've been going to World Championships where they never saw a Brit on the front, basically. So for them to see it like that, it was great. In my own mind, I felt, okay, at the end of the day, we're wasting two of our riders, but we are still, we're not deviating from our tactic. It could be argued that Charlie and Tom after 2/3 of the race would have been no use to Roger Hammond anyway, just by sitting in the bunch. They would have run out of legs anyway. World Championships is a funny race. It's one of the longest races on the calendar. And as a result of that, it suits some riders go really well on the day, some of them less so, sort of thing. So there's every chance they could have ridden in the bunch, done nothing, never been on the front whatsoever. And then we'd have had exactly the same result with Roger at the end of it anyway. So, so that's the background to the story. The fallout of it was massive because, it was like the journalists wanted blood, basically. And this is the British cycling journalists. It was quite, I found it quite amusing now looking back at it, how they were, why did it happen? It's a disgrace, two riders riding for another team, it's disgraceful, blah, blah. I'm going, hang on a minute, you're the same journalists that, like to tell me how knowledgeable you are about the sport. This has been going on since time immemorial. This is happening all the time. Whilst I've never heard the conversations, I believe Sean Kelly was in an unfortunate position of having to say, I don't know why they're doing this. He was also kept getting asked by the commentator, and Sean was also having to say, I don't know. Max Schiandri was interviewed behind the back of the tents to, right on camera to say, what's going on. He was having to deny of any collusion with the Italian teams, and because of his Italian background, he was also, sort of getting not accused, but sort of saying, you must know what's going on. Yeah. Dave Brailsford called the car a couple of times, but because Alistair Follering was in my car, I didn't, I had to sort of play it down. I said, no, it's all part of the tactics, Dave. Don't worry about it. It's all okay. So anyway, after it all, there was a debrief, and Dave took it very, very badly, and thought I betrayed him. Obviously thought the riders had, just they thought I had as well. And in fact, the opposite was true. Really, I was only trying to protect him. I didn't want to tell him anything, so that it would just stay with me, basically. So there would be no fallout from it. The British press, the cycling press, decided to make a big deal of it and tried to say that, well, this is, you went there on government money. The World Class Performance Programme is about British results, and here you are as a funded nation riding for, another team, basically. So it went on for some time, and obviously Tom and Charlie were brought in, and they were basically told they'd never ride for Great Britain again as a result of their actions. They both tried to justify it in much the same way that I've just done there, which I think you can justify it for that era. There's no question that it was an Italian mafia that sort of, I won't go as deep as to say it's the Casa Nostra, but it was certainly the Italian cycling mafia, that basically they had their arms at their backs basically, and they had to do it. So they were caught between a rock and a hard place, to be honest. So yeah, it was unfortunate. And it went on, we didn't know what we were going to do. And in the end, I offered to resign to try and sort of nip it in the bud. And so it went on for about a week afterwards with the journalists saying, you know, constantly phoning me. And I now, it was nothing like, I'm sure, some of the celebrities are harassed now, but it did feel like that. I was like, you know, the phone was constantly going. I was always picking the phone up to different journalists. They wanted to know, you know, when you know what was going to happen and what the result of the inquiry was going to be, and so on and so forth. And yeah, bizarrely, what happened is, it's not bizarrely, but I resigned, and after I resigned, it killed it stone dead within like 24 hours. Charlie and Tom were sanctioned. I said I'd stand down, I resign. Dave accepted that. Yeah, Dave accepted that, and as a result of that, you know, when I told the journalists when they came on the phone, and I said, "This is what's happened," they went, "Oh, well, we didn't want that to happen. We didn't want you to resign. We didn't." I said, "Well, you're the ones that are kicking up the fuss. You know, you're the ones that are making a big meal out of this. You know, big deal out of it, should I say? And are you know, trying to, you know, create trouble, trying to, you know, potentially sell more copies, so to speak. You're not." And anyway, so yeah, and to a man, they went, "Oh, really, really sorry, John. Oh, God, no, we didn't want this to happen." And they were mortified, you know, that I'd had to resign or offered to resign, and it was accepted. No, well, God, no, we didn't want that to happen. And it was like, oh my God. And at the time, again, this is the internet had just started, but we didn't have the amount of coverage that we do now. So you know, the main source of our information was Cycling Weekly, and the copy came out the week after the announcement had been made that I resigned, and I got what amounted to an obituary in Cycling Weekly. And it was like, I actually read it and thought, I might actually died here, you know. And yeah, so that was it. It was very, very strange. Called it, you know, killed it stone dead. Nothing was pretty much ever said about it again by the journalists. And nothing happened with the World Class Performance Programme or anything like that. Whether or not it ever got to government level, I'll never know. All I know is that, you know, I was no longer working for British Cycling. So that was it. The end of my career as the national team manager ended there with that, which, you know, it was an offer of a resignation that was accepted to get out of the situation, should we say. So there we go.
So that's where we leave the story for this edition. John's in limbo, no longer manager of the Great Britain Road Cycling team. And next time we get together, we'll be telling you the story of how John takes the reins of what at the time was recycling.co.uk. We'll tell you about some of the characters that are involved, and we'll start with the 2006 season and see where we get to. So yeah, see you next time.